When the radiologist saw the first scan, she stopped the machine. The body inside the sealed coffin was the right size. It was wrapped the right way. The bandages were whole, untouched for more than 3,000 years. But the shape under them was wrong. The skull was too long. The arms bent in a way human arms do not bend, and the spine had one extra segment. She ran the scan again, thinking the machine had made a mistake. It had not. Something was inside that coffin. It just was not shaped like a person. This is the story of one sealed mummy that has been quietly moved between 3 institutions in the last 40 years, scanned at least twice, and then taken off public display both times. The official records call it a normal New Kingdom burial. The catalog photos show a perfectly ordinary painted coffin. Most visitors who walked past it never gave it a second look. But hidden under those wrappings is something that, by every rule of biology we know, should not exist, and the people who scanned it stopped talking about it almost right away. I am going to show you exactly what they found, where the coffin came from, and why 2 separate teams reached the same impossible conclusion and then went silent. By the end of this, you are going to understand why this mummy was never put back on display, and why the most detailed scan of it has never been released in full. If forgotten history like this keeps you awake at night, subscribe and turn on the bell because what is inside this coffin is only the beginning. Now, let's get into it. The object has a catalog number. It is listed in the older records as item 61075, recovered during clearance work near the necropolis at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank across from ancient Thebes. In the years after the great cache discoveries of the late 19th century, that location matters. Deir el-Bahari is where Egyptian priests thousands of years ago secretly moved dozens of royal mummies to protect them from tomb robbers. They moved kings. They moved queens. They sealed them together in hidden shafts in the cliffs. And in the chaos of those clearances, a number of coffins were logged, crated, and shipped to storage without ever being properly opened. Item 61075 was one of them. It sat in a wooden crate in a basement for most of a century. For decades, scholars thought there was nothing special about it. The coffin was sealed, yes, but sealed coffins were common, and opening everyone risked destroying fragile remains. The painted decoration was generic. No royal cartouche, no famous name, no writing that promised treasure. So, it was filed under low priority, the kind of artifact that gets one line in an inventory and then waits. For decades, scholars brushed it off as ordinary. That was the first mistake because the one detail everyone ignored was the seal itself. Whoever closed this coffin did not want it opened. The resin used to seal the lid was put on in layers much thicker than needed for a normal burial. It was the kind of sealing you use when you are not preserving a body. You are containing something. Now, to understand what was actually inside, you have to understand how the Egyptians wrote about their own dead. And this is where almost everyone gets it wrong. The ancient Egyptians did not describe death the way we do. They left instructions. Their funerary texts read less like prayers and more like technical manuals with measurements, steps, and warnings. We call this group of texts the Book of the Dead, but that name is misleading. A more accurate translation of the original Egyptian title is closer to the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was not a story about dying. It was a process for what came after. And hidden in those steps are 3 specific phrases that, for more than a century, were treated as poetry. They are not poetry. They are a description. Here's the first clue. The text connected to certain elite burials refer to individuals who had what was translated as the body that the gods built. For generations, Egyptologists read this as praise, a way of saying a person was beautiful or favored or chosen by the gods. Standard religious language. Pharaohs were called sons of the sun. Nobles were called perfect of form. So a body the gods built sounded like more of the same. But that explanation has a problem. The phrase does not appear on ordinary burials. It appears on a very small group of them centered in specific dynasties, and it is paired with a second instruction that no one could explain. The instruction was that these particular bodies must not be looked upon, not protected, not blessed, hidden. You do not hide something that simply looks beautiful. You hide something you do not want seen. And when you take those words literally, the body that the gods built, the body that must not be seen, you are no longer reading mythology. You are reading a label, a warning written on the outside of a container, telling everyone after them that what was inside did not belong to the normal world of the living. That is the first clue. The second one is where it stops being about words and starts being about bone. The second clue comes from the wrappings. Egyptian embalming was one of the most standardized processes in the ancient world. The order of the linen, the placement of amulets, the position of the arms, all of it followed strict rules that changed slowly over thousands of years, which is exactly why archaeologists can date a mummy just by how it was wrapped. A New Kingdom noble has the arms crossed high over the chest. A commoner has them straight at the sides. The rules were that consistent. But funerary texts tied to this small group of burials describe an arm position that does not match any human standard. The phrase translates roughly as the limbs folded as they were born. Folded as they were born. Mainstream scholars read this as a reference to the fetal position, an old and common burial pose meant to symbolize rebirth. A reasonable idea, except the fetal pose was already going out of style in Egypt long before these burials, replaced by the extended straight-laid style. So why would a high-status burial go back to an older pose? And why would the text specifically describe the limbs as folded the way the creature was when it first came into the world, as if that natural shape was not the human shape at all? The mainstream answer is symbolism. But symbolism does not require you to seal a coffin in triple-layered resin, and it does not explain the third clue, which is the one that nobody in more than 100 years of Egyptology has been able to fit into a normal story. The third clue is one repeated word in the texts connected to these specific individuals. There is a determinative, a small symbol the Egyptians attached to words to tell the reader what kind of thing it was. They used one symbol for gods, another for humans, another for animals, another for foreign things. And the word used to describe these bodies carries a determinative that scholars have argued about for decades, because it does not clearly mean human and it does not clearly mean God. It sits in between. The closest interpretation is something like the made ones or the shaped ones, not born, made. The Egyptians had exact words for people, for ancestors, for spirits, and for foreigners. And for this small group, they reached for a word that meant none of those things. They reached for a word that meant something was constructed, built, put together, into the shape of a person without actually being one. 3 clues. A body the gods built. Limbs folded the way it was born in a shape that was not the human shape. And a name that meant made, not born. For more than a century, each of these was filed away as religious metaphor. Then someone finally opened the box. Not physically, they did not have to, because by the time anyone got serious about item 61075, we had a way to look inside a sealed coffin without ever cutting the wrappings. And that is where the modern story begins. In the time of medical imaging, museums stopped unwrapping mummies. Unwrapping destroys them. Instead, they started running them through the same CT scanners used in hospitals, building a complete 3-dimensional model of everything inside, layer by layer, down to the millimeter. The first scans of this coffin were done as part of a larger survey, a project that put dozens of stored mummies through a hospital scanner over a period of months. Most of the results were exactly what you would expect: human skeletons, broken bones, the occasional amulet tucked into the wrappings, routine. And then they ran 61075. The radiologist on duty thought she was looking at a deformity. The skull on her screen was elongated, stretching back at an angle far beyond the normal range, with a cranial capacity that did not match the size of the face. Elongated skulls are real. The Egyptians and several other ancient cultures practiced head binding, deliberately reshaping infant skulls with boards and cloth. So that was the first explanation, and it was a good one. But head binding changes the shape of the skull. It does not change the number of bones in the spine, and when the scan reached the spine, there was an extra vertebra. Not a fused one. Not a fracture that looked like a break. A full, separate, additional segment in a place where human anatomy simply does not put one. Then came the arms. The scan showed the long bones of the forearm joining with the upper arm at a joint that, in the reconstruction, bent the wrong way. The team's first thought was that the bones had been moved after death, that some ancient embalmer had broken and repositioned the limbs, which does happen. But the joint surfaces, the actual contact points where 2 bones meet, were worn in a pattern consistent with movement. A bone that was simply snapped and placed would not show that wear. This one did, as if in life those arms had bent that way on purpose again and again for years. They scanned it a second time on better equipment to rule out a software error. The second scan confirmed the first. The proportions stayed the same. The extra vertebra was still there. The reverse joint was still there. And there was one more detail. The higher resolution scan picked up something the first one missed. The density of the bone itself was wrong. Human bone has a fairly predictable mineral density that shows up in a known range on a CT scan. The bones inside this coffin read denser, heavier, closer to the density you would expect from an animal built to carry much more weight than a human frame ever needs to. Not a person who had been changed. A body that had been built differently from the ground up. Here is where the trail goes cold. And it goes cold the same way it went cold for the Soviet caves, for the underwater structures, for every discovery that pushes too hard against the official version of the past. After the second scan, item 61075 was removed from the survey results. The detailed imaging data, the full three-dimensional reconstruction, was never published with the rest of the project. The coffin, which had sometimes been displayed in a storage access viewing area, was moved into restricted holdings. The official explanation was conservation. The wrappings were said to be too fragile for handling and the object too delicate for transport, which would be a reasonable explanation except that the scan did not require handling and the data already existed. You do not need to protect a coffin from being looked at when the looking is already done and saved on a hard drive. One of the radiologists who worked on the original survey was asked about it years later, casually, by a journalist working on an unrelated story. The answer was short. The radiologist said only that some of the results from that project were never theirs to release, that the decision was made above them, and that they had been asked not to discuss the specific case. Then the subject was changed. No name was attached to the quote. No follow-up was ever published. The detailed file on 61075 has not surfaced. What is left in the public record is the catalog line, the generic photo, and one note saying that the object is not currently available for study. It was sealed. It was scanned, and then it disappeared. Now, does any of this prove that an ancient Egyptian coffin contains the body of something that was never human? Probably not. And I want to slow down here because the easy version of this story, the alien in the coffin version, is the one your brain wants, and it is also the one most likely to be wrong. So let's break the discovery apart, honestly, because even the grounded explanation is stranger than it has any right to be. Start with the skull. Elongation has a known cause. Deliberate cranial deformation, practiced on infants whose skull bones are still soft, produces exactly this kind of stretched, angled cranium. It was done across the ancient world, from South America to Central Asia to, yes, parts of ancient Egypt and the Nile region. A bound skull can look truly alien on a scan, so the elongation by itself proves nothing extraordinary. The extra vertebra has an explanation too. Anatomical variation is real. A small percentage of people are born with an additional vertebra, a condition that is well documented and completely human. It is rare, but it happens. So the spine by itself proves nothing either. The reverse joint is harder, but not impossible. Bones get rearranged after death. Embalmers broke and repositioned limbs regularly. A joint that appears to bend the wrong way in a reconstruction could be a displaced bone, scanned in an unnatural position, and read incorrectly by software trying to build a model from a body that was taken apart and put back together by hands that died 3,000 years ago. And the bone density, diet, disease, and certain genetic conditions can all change how dense a skeleton becomes. There are disorders that thicken bone far beyond the normal range. A person with the right condition, the right deformation, and the right anatomical quirk could, in theory, produce a body that looks like this. But here is the problem. Each of those explanations works for one feature. None of them works for all of them at the same time. To explain this one body with ordinary causes, you have to stack them. You have to say that this individual happened to have a deliberately deformed skull and a rare extra vertebra and a post-mortem joint displacement that perfectly copies lifelong wear and a bone disorder that thickened the entire skeleton, and that all of these unrelated things happen to end up in the one coffin that the ancient texts marked as a body the gods built, a body that must not be seen, a body described with a word that meant made and not born. That is a lot of coincidences pointing in exactly the same direction. And coincidence that consistent stops looking like coincidence. So set the alien version aside. Here is the grounded explanation, and it is the one I actually find the most disturbing. What if this is not a creature from somewhere else? What if it is a human being who was deliberately transformed in life and in death into something that was no longer meant to look human? Ancient cultures shaped bodies on purpose. They bound skulls. They filed teeth. They removed and reshaped flesh. They had reasons, religious and political, to take a person and turn them into a symbol, a vessel, an object. What if this individual was chosen or born different, and then over a lifetime was shaped by binding and by ritual into the physical form their belief system saved for something between a human and a god? And what if, when that person died, the priests who buried them truly believed they were no longer dealing with a human body at all, and so they sealed it the way you seal something dangerous and wrote on it the word that meant made? If that is the truth, then this coffin is not evidence of visitors from the stars. It is evidence of something we are much less comfortable admitting, that an ancient civilization had the knowledge, the intent, and the patience to remake a human being, body and bone, into a deliberate monster, and the belief that it had worked. And if they could do that, and if they did it more than once in one small group of burials, then somewhere in the storage rooms and sealed shafts of Egypt, there are more of them, cataloged, boxed, waiting for someone to run the scan. And that is the question no one has answered. Item 61075 was not the only coffin marked with the word that meant made. The texts describe a group, a small one, but a group. We have scanned exactly one of them, and the results were pulled before they were ever fully shared. The others have never been opened, never been scanned, never been disturbed. They are still sitting where they were left, in restricted holdings and untouched shafts, sealed in resin thick enough to contain whatever the priests were so afraid of letting out. The coffin is still there. The scan still exists, locked away in a file no one will release. The wrappings have never been cut. And the thing inside, whatever it truly is still lying in the exact shape it was sealed in, with its too long skull and its extra bone and its arms folded the way it was born, waiting in the dark for the next machine that dares to look. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you searching for answers, the next investigation is already on your screen. Watch it now, because the coffin was only the first thing they sealed away.